Washington's already strained relations with Havana have been rapidly deteriorating in recent weeks. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has repeatedly called Cuba a threat to national security amid fears the island nation has a fleet of drones that could be used to attack Florida. And the Trump administration has warned that a peaceful agreement with Cuba is unlikely. All of this comes as the island deals with an oil embargo imposed by the U.S. To discuss this further, we can bring in Andrés Pertierra, a historian of Latin America and the Caribbean, specializing on the history of Cuba. Andrés, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us. Now, an oil blockade, a growing U.S. military presence, federal charges, and repeated threats of intervention. We've heard this before. This looks like the playbook for the Venezuela operation. Do you think that scenario would work in Cuba?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. I think that certainly seems to be what Trump is trying to do, but I don't think that Cuba works in the same way. Um, just to cite a few obvious examples, um, so in Venezuela, it worked so far because the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was willing to cooperate with the Trump administration, and she was the next in line legally to be in power. In Cuba, um, if they take out Raul Castro, okay, well, he's maybe like a powerful figure, but he has no official position. In Cuba, the power does not necessarily obey any sort of institutional framework, right? And Diaz-Canel is already very unpopular and an easy scapegoat. So removing him might actually make it easier for the government. So I'm not really sure how the Venezuela playbook would work even on paper, much less in practice, for an elite that definitely would reasonably fear that a post overthrow situation or any sort of understanding with the US would leave them vulnerable to later having Florida come in and push for really harsh criminal charges and investigations in jail and the rest.
Now, Andres, as you mentioned there, if the Trump administration does move forward with a Venezuelan scenario, there is no indication of who would step in to that leadership void. So, what does a U.S. peaceful takeover of the island really look like? Do we have any indications?
Not especially. I'm not really sure how it would work because historically, if we look at peaceful transitions, like look at Chile after Pinochet, Spain after Franco, normally there is the military is willing to basically take a step back and not fight it to the end because they understand that they will be safe, that there will be some sort of amnesty, which will also be respected, and no one has a definitive advantage, and therefore everyone's willing to compromise on what they want. It's hard to see Trump, especially Marco Rubio, who's really in the driver's seat for Cuba policy, accepting that. It would not be acceptable to do a Venezuela situation for Cuba for the Florida voting base of the GOP, and Florida is an important state for them electorally, nationally. Um, and at the same time, I wouldn't trust any sort of promises. If I were a Cuban general, I wouldn't trust any promises that the US is going to respect an amnesty or an agreement not to touch them in a transition situation.
Now, Andres, let's talk a minute about these drones and the indictment of Raul Castro. Cuba
Mhm.
says that the U.S. is using both of those things to make a fraudulent case to justify military intervention. So, do you think Cuban officials would actually authorize drone attacks against the U.S.?
Never proactively. That would be suicide in many ways. It would be giving the US the excuse for a military intervention. And Cuba knows that it stands no chance in a conventional war. The plan has always been a guerrilla war of some kind. Um, However, if the US forces Cuba to defend itself in a military context, Cuba doesn't have the capability to do like the Hormuz Strait strategy that Iran is doing, where it shuts down the Yucatan and Florida Straits. But maybe it can threaten to kind of occasionally attack some ships or something and use that to impose some kind of cost on the US, increase costs of transporting goods and increase insurance requirements. So it would be a very poor cousin to Hormuz. But if I were Cuba, I would also be like investing in drones just as a backup plan. Obviously, it's not going to be definitive, but the idea is hold on and impose pain, and that seems to have worked for Iran. So.
Now, Andres, as we've established, you're a historian. There's been decades of mistrust between Cuba and the U.S. Do you believe the two sides can come to some form of a negotiated solution?
I think that such a solution was possible a decade ago under Obama because it was kind of a new status quo. There was a normalization strategy at play, and there wasn't this kind of gun to the head, like maximum pressure strategy from the US. With Trump, he's basically the rhetorical device worst case scenario that the Cubans have been warning about what the US is for decades, but made flesh, incarnated, right? And so it's really hard to see them not compromising with Trump for ideological reasons. It would be a betrayal for their whole life mission, their whole identity. It would be an act of betrayal to their country as they see it. It would be something that wouldn't even work out practically because this would just be giving the hardest hard right, the ability to ride roughshod over Cubans and dictate everything in Cuba. So I'm not sure with this approach how that's possible. There might be a collapse, but a collapse is very different from a negotiated transition.
Well, we know that both sides have been having these indirect talks. The CIA director was just there on a visit, and the U.S. also wants to see Cuba release political prisoners and institute some kinds of economic reforms. So, how willing is Cuba to continue talks in possibility of an exchange for some sanctions being lifted?
Cuba's been consistently open to talks throughout this process. Um, but they've also been very consistent that there are red lines that they will not cross, and one of them is restructuring the political system. So I could see them agreeing to releasing some political prisoners like Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, but in exchange for some kind of trade with the US. But given that the core tension is regime change of some kind or a transition of some kind, that seems like a more insoluble problem because they know that that would basically be political suicide. If, especially with the discontent on the island, the despair and anger, if they enact liberalizing reforms in the political sphere, I don't think they would last in power very long. So they really I don't see how they would agree to that in practice.
And Andres, one final question. As you mentioned there is despair on the island because all of this is happening as the U.S. imposes that oil embargo. Only one Russian tanker had been able to get through. So conditions on the island are, worsening with all of this. How are ordinary Cubans coping?
Um, Cuba is used to suffering severe shortages of all kinds and make jokes about it and figure out solutions. But Cubans are living a level of despair I've never seen, a level of hopelessness. The even the capital, which had been insulated from the mass blackouts, is no longer as insulated anymore. You're talking about 20 to 22 hour a day blackouts in the capital. The economy is paralyzed. Medicine is near impossible to come by. Tourism is effectively dead, and so that means no hard currencies, and so that it's a total crisis. The healthcare system is barely holding on. Education is collapsing. Agriculture has long collapsed. Like anyone who can leave has, and many who are left are trying to. 1 in 5, roughly, have left in the last 6 years. So about 20% of the population has left in the last 6 years, which is incredible for a country not in a state of war. And it's hard to see how that will change anytime soon.
Andres, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. That's Andres Pertierra, a historian of Latin America and the Caribbean.